Today's session will focus on understanding how you can support pupils with educational disadvantage in science education, in particular across the primary to secondary transition. This builds on the learning you may have had on supporting inclusion and social justice in science education. My name is Dr. Lynne Bianchi, and I'm the Director of the Science and Engineering Education Research and Innovation Hub at the University of Manchester. In this session, I will draw on a newly published report to explore understandings around educational disadvantage. I'll consider how the transition phase from primary to secondary school can impact on children's learning experiences in science. And I'm going to share with you some strategies that we've worked on to improve progression and inclusion in science classrooms, with the ultimate goal of enhancing social justice. I'm really proud to share with you the Shining a Light on Inclusive Science Teaching and Learning report, launched in June 2022. This focuses on the key learning arising from the Smarter Choices project, which was a 3-year research and innovation study in collaboration with the Shine Trust, the Commonwealth Foundation and 6 schools in North Manchester. You can access the report by using the QR code or the download link here. The context for the report is one that is well considered. The fact that there is a clear evidence to suggest that there is a gap in science outcomes between disadvantaged pupils and their classmates at every stage in the education system. The work by the Science Capital research teams also reinforced that pupils experience school science that is abstract, disconnected, and irrelevant to their lives. This was the stimulus for dedicated effort by the science subject leaders, science teachers, head teachers, and research mentors to do 3 key things. One was to review the needs and experiences of pupils who were considered disadvantaged in some way in their classrooms. Then they sought to identify where most disparity came between their understandings of science teaching in the primary classroom and in the secondary classroom, where most things change for the pupils. And lastly, we were interested to see how we could support teachers to work together on these issues by refining some of the routines for sharing information between primary and secondary teachers and the collaboration between them. So ultimately, we're trying to solve the problem of the disconnect between pupils' experiences across the transition within the context of school science teaching, and for those children who've got the most significant educational disadvantage of some kind. The Education Endowment's implementation guide was really helpful in getting us to structure how we went about this project. Please have a look at that report if you haven't done so already. I encourage you to consider the key areas of learning that we studied. Firstly, what does disadvantage mean for you and your pupils when learning science? Secondly, what practices in school are there to support transition in science? And thirdly, whether the vocabulary development that you undertake with your students actually supports them to access science better. When thinking about educational disadvantage, I'd like you to think more broadly than just the strategic identifier of pupil premium. I'd like you to think about the things that really affect your pupils in your classroom, say for instance on Monday morning at 9:30. These features of disadvantage may actually be more granular and specific than pupil premium. In fact, it may be that pupils experience vulnerabilities that ebb and flow, or something that regularly holds them back to accessing science learning. You might want to pause this film now and just jot down a few thoughts about this topic. In our case schools, teachers spoke openly about their experiences, and we undertook lesson visits to look at pupil engagement in learning. We looked specifically at pupils who were eligible for pupil premium, but we also had a further eye on the full cohort of pupils. You can see that the schools found that poor vocabulary and language, as well as pupils' low aspirations, were both common features of educational disadvantage in their classrooms. In one school, poor attendance caused problems, and in the other, the lack of assessment data that was shared that led to pupils not being grouped to their own potential. How much do you acknowledge and discuss with your colleagues within school and across the schools between primary and secondary those vulnerabilities that you see that your pupils experience in science on a day-to-day basis? When looking at the practices of science, transition in science, we were thinking in terms of different bridges that schools can develop. Ruth Sutton's work allowed us to be clear in that in this project we were seeking to explore the curriculum and the pedagogical bridge, and those were what we were most interested in looking at in terms of children's science learning. For this, it really meant that we looked together at lesson structures, teaching approaches, and the way learning was recorded and valued in the primary and the secondary science lessons. Teachers openly discussed their lessons and explored them from different perspectives. It's important to say that we weren't wanting teachers to change their practice at this stage in the study. We wanted them to really look and reflect on it and understand it together. We weren't looking for primary teachers to teach like secondary teachers or secondary teachers to adopt primary pedagogy, but we were wanting all those science teachers to share and understand each other's practice. But why? In order that we had understanding of pupils' learning, we wanted to look at the consistency between the phases. This is where the reframing of the project became so crucial. We found it more positive as a group not to talk about educational disadvantage or vulnerabilities that hold us back, but to consider inclusive science pedagogies. And we found it better to switch our focus from transition, which often describes interventions or activities done with 11-year-olds, and to talk about progression. By making this switch, the project moved to being one about including all pupils, so that all could be involved and progress together to reach their potential. Consider the transition practices that happen in your school. What kind of transition do they support? Is it the emotional and social bridge, or is it the curriculum or pedagogical bridge? Using a collaborative approach to teacher reflection, there was a joint decision to tackle the issue of vocabulary development in science lessons. This was at the root of many issues that influenced pupils' engagement in science, and was in fact that they found scientific language and vocabulary challenging and often strange to them. In particular, pupils with English as a second language, but also for many others who found scientific terminology difficult. Working with specialists, the use of the Freya and Seek model were trialled. Common to both the primary and secondary science classrooms, the pupils explored what key words meant to them, examples of the word in use, and also the opposite of the word. Teachers considered the key language that progressed across the school science curriculum from primary to secondary, and they also spoke with each other about the language which differed between the primary and secondary classrooms and discussed the reasons for that as well. The most fundamental aspect of learning, whether we understand the language that we hear, because at the end of the day that unlocks learning for many pupils. So to summarise, we accept that the big strategic national identifiers, such as pupil premium, open up funding streams and provide a large-scale national awareness of children's needs. However, these systemic identifiers seemed crude and too broad to influence our day-to-day science teaching and learning. We have shown in this study the importance of shining a light on what really influences pupils' learning and what really prevents them from accessing science and succeeding. Too often, primary and secondary science teachers have been expected to accommodate for these factors in an ad hoc or intuitive way. So here is a call-out for a much more explicit and planned approach to science across the transition, where teachers come together to consider how their pupils move between primary and secondary schools. It has long been the case that this is problematic when there are large numbers of primary schools feeding into secondaries. However, what this project has shown is that by using webinars, digital shared documents, and shared reflections, we can actually achieve our goal without even leaving our classrooms. Connecting is much easier than it's ever been, and by adopting an approach which appreciates everyone's professionalism rather than seeking to change them, it will make for a culture where progression and inclusion in science learning work hand in hand to the benefit of all children. If you're interested to read more on this topic, you can access an article using this QR code. We continue with this work in earnest, and would be keen to hear from you too about your experiences. In the meantime, I acknowledge all of the schools and contributors to this study and encourage you to share the document forward with those in your school and in your science department.